It starts with the skin. Rashes break out on the hands, the neck, and on the face, in a shape like a butterfly's wings. The wounds deepen to lesions, raw and red, with dry, scaly edges where the skin flakes off like ash. The digestive system starts to break down, accompanied by bleeding in the mucous membranes of the mouth, which stain the gums and tongue a deep, dark red. Eating becomes painful. The body wastes away. Then the mind. Lethargy, confusion, changes in mood, loss of memory, hallucinations, delusions, convulsions, delirium, madness, and death. Why must a sentient human being suffer this? For you have seen the disease that is more to be dreaded than smallpox, than leprosy, than the Black Death. You have seen Pellagra. For nearly half a century, the southern United States was ravaged by an epidemic of pellagra, a disease unlike any other, a disease that causes madness. It is estimated that over 3 million people were affected by the outbreak, with at least 100,000 fatalities, though given the limitations of medical reporting in the early 1900s, it is likely that the total number of victims was much, much higher. Yet despite the devastation wrought by the disease, pellagra is rarely spoken of, and the epidemic has been almost entirely forgotten. Almost. The disease we call pellagra was first discovered in the year 1735 in Spain, but it was not named pellagra until 1771, when an outbreak in northern Italy led doctors to both combine the words pellagra, or rough skin, into the disease's name, and blame its occurrence on spoiled corn or maize crops, which had only recently become a staple food source in Italy at the time, and so it was assumed that pellagra was caused by something akin to ergot, which had been a known danger for centuries, being a fungus that grows on rye grain and can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. For the next few centuries, pellagra was assumed to be a minor European problem. It wasn't until 1902 that the first case of pellagra would be reported in the US, in the state of Georgia, but by the time it was identified, it was already too late. Outbreaks occurred one after the other, with cases initially limited to mental institutions and sanatoriums in Alabama and South Carolina, before exploding into epidemic proportions among the general population of the South. At first, American physicians, like their European counterparts, assumed that the disease was caused by mold-contaminated corn, since that was the primary grain that Southerners relied on for their food, often to the point of corn being the only food source for many poor sharecroppers and cotton mill workers. But as the epidemic progressed, and the majority of diagnosed cases had close contact to others with pellagra, it seemed more and more likely to doctors that pellagra was an infectious disease, instead of being corn-linked. After all, the native peoples of the Americas had relied on corn as the staple crop for millennia, and they had no records of the disease. By 1908, the fact that pellagra was an epidemic was undeniable, and a national conference on pellagra was held in Columbia, South Carolina. It was a chance for hundreds of physicians from across the country to discuss with public health authorities the pellagra cases they had observed. Newspaper headlines were made about the meeting, hopeful that some progress in combating it might be achieved. But as it turned out, the headlines were the spark that touched off a public hysteria about the spread of the disease. By the 1910s, a mass panic dubbed pellagraphobia had taken hold. The public understanding of germ theory was still very limited, as it was in its infancy, but fear of contagion was well rooted indeed, and no one wanted to be struck with pellagra's horrifying effects. Pellagra became a modern leprosy. Victims of the disease, who were predominantly desperately poor to begin with, found themselves abandoned and ostracized by those around them, and faced a mortality rate estimated at 40%. But even in the midst of public fear and paranoia, efforts were underway to study pellagra. It was a race against time to try to identify the disease's cause, and from there, hopefully, a cure. Though the field of epidemiology was still in its infancy, the federal government's Public Health Service did its best to study the epidemic, with top scientists theorizing that pellagra might have been spread via insect bite in a manner similar to the then recently discovered transmission of malaria. But their team was severely underfunded and therefore struggled to make any progress. Attempts were made to infect laboratory animals with pellagra by injecting them with samples of blood, spinal fluid, and spleen matter taken from deceased pellagra victims, but these experiments proved unsuccessful. None of the animals contracted the disease, even after months of trying, and the PHS's research was decried as a waste of time. Privately funded investigations made a bit more progress, but not much. The Thompson-McFadden Commission, founded by a pair of wealthy philanthropists, conducted epidemiological surveys of pellagra-stricken cotton mill villages and found that pellagra cases were more prevalent in households which lacked proper sanitation, and that 80% of victims had had confirmed close contact to a pre-existing case. It is worth mentioning, however, that even though it was also demonstrable that pellagra was most prevalent in the poorest neighborhoods, with poverty being the reason for inadequate sanitary facilities, this potential contributing factor was ignored by the surveys. At the time, it was considered deeply embarrassing for Southerners to so much as acknowledge just how common extreme poverty was in their communities. The Commission's reports concluded that pellagra must have been either directly transmissible or spread by an insect such as flies or lice. Investigations stalled at this point until 1914, when the Public Health Service was finally given the funding it needed to truly begin to fight back against the spread of pellagra, and most importantly, they had a new head of the investigation, Dr. Joseph Goldberger. Goldberger was a true outsider to the world of the rural South, having immigrated from Hungary to New York City as a child, and spending most of his adult life studying epidemics and combating disease with the PHS. By the time he was assigned to the pellagra investigation, Goldberger was a veteran epidemiologist, but almost more crucially, he was unaccustomed to the lifestyle and norms of the South, and wasn't afraid to ask questions that locals wouldn't dare to. When Goldberger began his investigation, observing pellagra patients in hospital settings, he immediately noticed how strange it was that none of the hospital staff he encountered showed any symptoms of the disease, despite spending so much time in close proximity to their patients and eating from the same cafeterias. As someone who had contracted many illnesses himself in his time tending to victims of various epidemics, Goldberger knew right away from the staff's lack of infection that there was little chance of pellagra being directly contagious. But if both the affected and unaffected were eating the same food, then diet didn't seem to be the problem either. And then Goldberger noticed something. Yes, the hospital staff and patients were given the same food, but the staff had first pick, and they tended to take the best, freshest food, particularly milk, eggs, and meat, for themselves, while the patients were left to subsist largely on cornbread and a few vegetables here and there. Goldberger began to form a theory. Perhaps pellagra was caused by corn after all, but not by something in the corn, rather the fact that something was missing from the corn. Perhaps it fit into the category of nutritional deficiency diseases like scurvy, rickets, and beriberi, all of which were the most common among those who were forced to eat a monotonous and limited diet. That certainly seemed to align with what Goldberger had observed, so he had to test his theory. He began by providing the children of a pellagra-stricken orphanage with the exact foods he had noticed the pellagra patients lacking: fresh milk and meat. Within a matter of months, the number of pellagra cases at the orphanage had dwindled to nothing. Goldberger was now certain that some nutrient, which could be found in animal and vegetable proteins, most notably yeast, an important discovery due to being easily stored and transported, was missing from corn, and that the absence of what he called pellagra preventative factor was what caused the symptoms of pellagra to develop. But convincing Southern politicians that their mystery disease was a result of the very poverty they fought to deny would be an uphill battle no matter what, and so Goldberger's theory needed proof, undeniable proof, and he found it in one of the most unlikely of places: prison. In 1915, in exchange for a promise of a governor's pardon, 12 healthy inmates of the Mississippi State Prison volunteered to be put on restricted diets in order for Goldberger to determine whether this would give them pellagra. 6 months later, 6 of the volunteers had it, while the rest of the prison remained healthy. Goldberger had his proof, but when the story hit the news, it was met with outrage, and not for the reasons you'd think. Accepting that pellagra was a deficiency disease would mean publicly acknowledging that large portions of the southern population were struggling to not starve. It would practically be the same as admitting that the economic system of the South, even half a century after the end of slavery and the Civil War, was still based on human suffering. When it came down to a choice between saving lives and saving face, Southern pride won out. The cause of pellagra was hotly debated, and any dietary or economic factors were roundly ignored, even as aid shipments of yeast to flood-stricken areas along the Mississippi in 1927 proved successful in reducing the number of pellagra cases. It was not until the end of the Second World War that the epidemic was finally brought under control. In 1937, chemist Konrad Elvejem was able to definitively conclude that Goldberger's PPF was vitamin B3, also known as niacin. With the key to pellagra's blood-red rain finally identified, niacin was soon added as a nutritional enrichment to staples such as flour, breads, and cereals, and pellagra became a thing of the past almost overnight. Pellagra is no longer a public health concern in developed countries. As to why the epidemic occurred in the first place, it is likely that new machine methods of milling corn, which were introduced in the very beginning of the 1900s, stripped away far more of the outer husk of the corn kernel than manual methods did, and in doing so they strongly reduced the amount of micronutrients that the corn could provide. Maize contains little to no niacin, meaning that those southerners who relied entirely on it for their food were severely deficient in vitamin B3 and therefore developed pellagra. But why did Native Americans who also relied on corn not contract the same disease? The key lies in how the corn is prepared. When corn is ground into meal, it does not naturally form a dough with water the way flour does. Europeans and their descendants simply tolerated this, but Native Americans, on the other hand, had long ago discovered that soaking the corn in an alkaline solution, such as a combination of water and wood ash or ground limestone, caused a process called nixtamalization, in which the protein structures of the corn broke down just enough to become digestible upon consumption. On a practical level, this allows cornmeal to become dough more easily, but on a chemical level, it means that the amino acid tryptophan, which is found in corn but is not digestible by humans if the corn is unprocessed, becomes biologically available, and tryptophan can be converted by the body into niacin. Niacin plays a vital role in cellular regeneration, meaning that without it, old and damaged cells cannot be replaced quickly enough for the body's organs to remain functioning. The parts of the body with the highest rates of cellular turnover, in other words, the greatest need for new cells, are the skin, the digestive tract, and the brain. With pellagra, the entire body is starving. Some parts just die faster than others.